The Stone That Wept Shadows. The air inside St. Meridian Cathedral was a stagnant, frigid breath held for centuries. Elias Turner, a man whose 30 years had been largely confined to the hushed sanctity of university archives, felt its icy exhalation against his face the moment he pushed open the warped iron-banded door. The hinges shrieked, a sound like a tortured throat, before a heavy thud announced its reluctant closure, plunging him into a gloom so profound it seemed to press against his very eyes. Elias adjusted the strap of his satchel, its weight a familiar comfort, and flicked on his headlamp. A pale, focused beam cut through the inky blackness, revealing a scene of monumental desolation. Dust, thick and undisturbed, coated every surface, shimmering like powdered moonlight in the artificial glow. It was an ancient particulate snow, fallen generations ago and never melted. The silence that followed the door's groan was not empty, but heavy, pregnant with unspoken histories and the ghost of forgotten rites. It was the silence of a tomb, vast and echoing. He had come for the history, the cold, hard facts of the place. St. Meridian, abandoned since the late 17th century, a casualty of religious fervor and a local superstition that had blossomed into full-blown terror. The official records spoke of a plague, a devastating outbreak that decimated the local populace. But the hushed whispers, the apocryphal tales, painted a far more unsettling picture. A priest, Father Alaric, driven to perform a ritual, to summon a presence not meant for this universe. A presence that had, allegedly, consumed the very soul of the cathedral and everyone within it. Elias, the skeptical historian, had dismissed it as folklore, the desperate invention of a terrified populace. Yet, standing amidst the skeletal remains of what was once a bastion of faith, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, began to pierce his academic resolve. The nave stretched before him, an inverted ship's hull of colossal proportions, ribbed with dark skeletal timbers. Where once stained glass windows would have cast kaleidoscopic prayers across the stone floor, now only jagged teeth of glass remained, holding aloft tattered canvases of sky. Moonlight, weak and watery, bled through the gaps, painting the dust-choked air with ethereal, shifting columns. Pews, carved from ancient dark wood, lay toppled and splintered like fallen dominoes in some forgotten game. A faint, acrid scent hung in the air, damp earth, decaying wood, and something else. Something metallic, like old blood, or perhaps the ozone tang of a storm that had never broken. Elias took a deep breath, the dust rasping in his throat. He pulled a surgical mask from his pocket, a concession to the practicalities of archaeological work, but it felt flimsy, utterly inadequate against the pervasive sense of dread that began to seep into his bones. His footsteps, amplified by the cavernous space, crunched softly on debris, fragments of mortar, splinters of wood, and what looked disturbingly like calcified bone shards. He imagined the last living soul to walk this aisle, their hurried retreat, their final echoing scream. The thought was unwelcome, intrusive. He was here for facts, for records, for the tangible remnants of human endeavor, not spectral imaginings. He moved slowly, methodically, his headlamp sweeping the decaying grandeur. Frescoes, once vibrant depictions of saints and biblical scenes, were now obscured by centuries of grime and the slow creep of mold, their divine faces melting into grotesque, weeping forms. The stone walls themselves seemed to weep, streaks of mineral deposits resembling dried tears. Every shadow seemed to possess an unnatural depth, a quality of sentience, as if they were observing him from the periphery of his vision. He found himself turning quickly, just catching the tail end of what seemed to be a deeper shade, a denser knot in the fabric of the gloom, before it dissolved back into the general darkness. His rational mind attributed it to optical illusions, the tricks of an ancient, ruined space. but the pit of his stomach churned with a primal unease. The temperature dropped noticeably as he neared the chancel, the space where the altar once stood. Here the destruction was more pronounced, more violent. The roof had collapsed entirely at some point, a gaping maw in the cathedral's crown, allowing the elements free rein. The altar itself was a heap of rubble, shattered marble, twisted metal, and splintered timber. Vines, thick as his arm, snaked through the destruction, holding the ruins in a verdant, suffocating embrace. It looked less like a collapse and more like an implosion, as if something immense had erupted from beneath, or perhaps been violently pressed down from above. Elias knelt amidst the debris, his gloved hands sifting carefully through the layers of broken stone and desiccated plaster. His headlamp illuminated the intricate carvings on what remained of the altar base, faded symbols of the Holy Trinity obscured by lichen and centuries of slow decay. He was searching for any remnants of Father Alaric's life, any diaries, any personal effects, anything that might shed light on the events that led to the cathedral's abandonment. The official account, a terse parish letter, only stated a grave spiritual affliction had necessitated the closure. The vague phrasing always struck Elias as peculiar, an evasion. Hours bled into a timeless continuum of dust and shadows. The outside world, with its predictable rhythms of day and night, felt impossibly distant. The only sounds were the soft scrape of his gloves against stone, the occasional drip of moisture from the unseen roof, and the persistent, almost imperceptible whisper of the wind through the broken windows, a sound that seemed to carry with it a multitude of forgotten voices. It was then, as his fingers probed a particularly deep fissure beneath a massive chunk of fallen marble, that he felt something unyielding, yet not stone. It was a cold, smooth surface, distinct from the rough masonry. With careful effort, he managed to lever the marble aside, revealing a cavity, a small, dark space that had somehow been protected from the full force of the collapse. Inside, nestled among fragments of what appeared to be a rotted wooden chest, lay a collection of unbound pages. They were not brittle with age as he would have expected. Instead, their parchment-like material possessed an unnatural flexibility, a peculiar resilience that defied their evident antiquity. They felt cold to the touch, colder than the surrounding stone. Elias extracted them with a delicate touch, laying them flat on a relatively clear slab of stone. His headlamp beam played over their surface, and a shiver, not entirely from the cold, snaked down his spine. The script was unlike anything he had ever encountered. It was not Latin, not Greek, nor any known ancient tongue he could identify. The characters were elongated, angular, with sharp, almost painful curves, resembling distorted thorns or twisted bones. They seemed to writhe on the page like trapped insects. But it wasn't just the script. Interspersed among the lines were sigils, intricate geometric patterns that defied conventional symmetry. They were etched in what appeared to be a dark, iridescent ink, an impossible hue that absorbed light rather than reflected it. As Elias leaned closer, his breath hitched. The sigils, they moved. Subtly, almost imperceptibly, the lines and angles of the symbols seemed to shift, to reconfigure themselves. A corner that had been sharp would momentarily soften. A straight line would subtly bend, only to snap back into its original form an instant later. It was like watching a living organism pulse, or the slow, deliberate unfolding of some alien geometric flower. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, convinced it was an illusion brought on by fatigue and the flickering light. But when he looked again, the minute, unsettling dance continued. The sigils were not static ink on parchment. They were fluid, restless, alive.
A whisper, barely audible, slithered into the periphery of his hearing. It was not a distinct word, but a composite of sounds, a dry rustle, a faint hiss, a breath of air that was too close, too personal for a solitary man in a ruined church. Elias froze, his heart thudding against his ribs. He swept his headlamp around the empty chancel, but there was nothing, only the broken stone, the dust, the shadows. He dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps the creaking of the ancient structure settling.
He refocused on the pages, his historian's curiosity overriding his nascent fear. He traced a finger along the edge of one page, the parchment cool and strangely smooth. As his gaze lingered on a particularly complex sigil, its lines seeming to contract and expand with a slow, deliberate rhythm, the whisper returned. This time, it was clearer, closer. It was a multi-layered sound, like dry leaves skittering across a vast empty plain, or countless tiny voices murmuring just beyond the threshold of understanding. It seemed to emanate not from a single point, but from the very air around him, a diffuse, omnipresent murmur that pricked at the edges of his sanity. He pulled his hand back, a sudden chill gripping him. He had not made a sound, had not moved. He was completely alone. He picked up another page, its surface slick with the same unnerving coolness. The script was consistent, the shifting sigils identical in their unsettling vitality. He began to read, or rather to interpret the abstract forms as best he could, searching for any recognizable pattern, any root in existing linguistic structures. He recognized no individual character, but the overall composition, the relentless linearity of the script, felt ancient beyond measure, predating even the oldest Semitic languages. It was a language designed not for communication, but for something else entirely. As his eyes scanned the alien text, trying to imprint its impossible forms into his memory, the whispers intensified. They were no longer subtle. They swirled around him, a vortex of barely coherent sound. He heard what sounded like the distant, mournful wail of a child, quickly subsumed by a guttural, wet, clicking sound. Then a voice, deep and resonant, seemed to thrum against his very bones, speaking in the same unknowable language as the text before him. It was a language of shadows and echoes, of primordial dread. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The dust motes, once dancing in his headlamp's beam, seemed to slow, to hang suspended, caught in an invisible web. Elias felt a pressure building in his skull, a dull ache behind his eyes. His rational mind screamed for him to stop, to put the pages down, to flee this place. But a deeper, more primal part of him, a morbid fascination, held him captive. He was a historian, a seeker of truth, and these pages were screaming a truth more profound and terrifying than any he had ever imagined. He continued to read, his gaze fixed on the impossibly shifting sigils. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, coalescing into a cacophony of spectral sound. He could distinguish individual voices now, a woman's desperate gasp, a man's broken prayer, the dry rattle of bones. They seemed to press in on him from all sides, a chorus of suffering and ancient malevolence. The air grew colder still, so cold that he could see his breath plume before him, a fleeting ghost in the haunted space. His heart hammered, a frantic drum against the silence. He was no longer alone. The whispers were proof of that. The shifting sigils, the unearthly cold, the profound, resonant voice that seemed to speak from the very foundations of the ruined church. These were not tricks of light or imagination. He had stumbled upon something forbidden, something ancient, something that had been patiently waiting in the cold, dark embrace of Saint Meridian. And by merely looking, by merely reading, he had disturbed its slumber. The cathedral had been silent for centuries, a petrified monument to a forgotten terror.
Now, as Elias Turner's eyes traced the alien script, its ancient walls began to stir, to breathe, to whisper. And the whispers were calling out to him, beckoning him deeper into the darkness he had unwittingly awakened. Part 2. The whispers had coalesced. No longer a distant rustle, they were now a suffocating shroud, a multitude of phantom voices pressed against Elias's ears, each a needle prick of dread. He could feel their phantom breath, cold and stale on his skin. He clutched the ancient pages, the cool, unnerving parchment clinging to his gloved fingers. The sigils pulsed with a faint internal light, like embers breathing in the gloom, their lines shifting with a frantic, silent energy. "Who's there?" Elias's voice was a ragged whisper, swallowed instantly by the roaring silence that followed his question. The echoes of his own words seemed to twist, to prolong themselves into something elongated and distorted, as if mocked by the very stone. Then a sound, clear and chilling, broke through the cacophony of whispers. It was a child's giggle, light and innocent, echoing from the ruined nave. Elias's head snapped up, his headlamp beam cutting a frantic swath through the darkness. The giggle was followed by another and another, weaving together into a tapestry of spectral mirth. It was the sound of children at play, innocent and pure, but here, in this tomb of faith, it was a grotesque aberration, a violation of the sacred silence. His light found nothing but fractured pews and the skeletal remains of the roof. Yet the giggles grew closer, seeming to dance around the pillars, to skip across the debris-strewn floor. Elias felt a cold sweat prickle his scalp, an instinct screaming at him that this was wrong, profoundly wrong. He was alone. He had to be alone. Suddenly, the laughter fractured. A single high-pitched shriek ripped through the air, raw and full of unutterable terror. It was the sound of a child in absolute agony, a sound that twisted the innocent giggles into something monstrous. The shriek was joined by others, a chorus of tiny voices escalating into a crescendo of pure, unadulterated screams, echoing and multiplying until the entire cathedral seemed to vibrate with their suffering. It was as if the joyous spirits of children had been suddenly, violently plunged into an abyss of despair, their mirth inverted into a horrifying testament to pain. Elias stumbled backward, dropping the pages with a gasp. They landed softly on the stone, their alien script continuing its silent internal dance. The screams seemed to converge on him, pressing in from all directions, each one a phantom hand clawing at his mind. He covered his ears, but the sound was inside him, vibrating in his teeth, resonating in his very bones. His headlamp beam, shaking violently, caught something in the upper reaches of the nave. Hanging from the massive, decaying timbers of the ceiling, where once intricate carvings of angels might have adorned the apex, were dark forms. They were indistinct, like ink blots against the faint moonlight filtering through the shattered roof, but their shape was unmistakable. They were human silhouettes, inverted, suspended by their ankles, swaying gently in an unseen current of air. Their heads hung limp, their forms elongated by the distance and the gloom, but Elias could feel their vacant gaze, an unseen accusation. They were like grotesque, silent pendants adorning the desecrated space. He tore his eyes away, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This was beyond history, beyond rational explanation. This was a nightmare made manifest, born from the very stone and shadow of the cathedral. He had to get out. Every fiber of his being screamed for escape, for the cold, unfeeling logic of the outside world. But as he turned to flee, his path was blocked. From behind a colossal, crumbling archway, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom. It was a perfect human silhouette, sharp and defined, yet it moved with an unnatural fluidity, a disjointed grace that defied the laws of physics. It glided across the floor, completely independent of any light source, a patch of pure, concentrated darkness. It did not walk, it flowed, its edges never quite static, shimmering like heat haze. Then another shadow detached from a broken column, and another from a collapsed confessional booth. They moved with an eerie, silent purpose, converging, slowly, deliberately, on Elias. They were not merely absences of light, they were presences of darkness, entities crafted from the very fabric of night, each one a silent, watchful sentinel. They moved like hunters, circling him, their edges seeming to pulse, to breathe. A sudden, sharp clang echoed from the bell tower, a single, resonant note that sliced through the lingering screams. It was the sound of a massive iron bell, struck with immense force. Elias whipped his head around, his lamp beam darting frantically upwards. The bell tower, a skeletal finger pointing to the heavens, was a ruin. He knew from his preliminary research that the bells had been removed centuries ago, either salvaged or fallen during the initial collapse. There were no ropes, no clappers, nothing that could possibly produce such a sound. Yet another clang resonated, then another, a slow, deliberate tolling that reverberated through the very foundation of the church, a death knell for something unseen. Each toll sent a jarring tremor through Elias's body, vibrating in his chest cavity. The shadows were closer now, their forms elongated and grotesque in the shifting light of his lamp. They didn't have faces, but he felt an undeniable sense of being observed, scrutinized by an ancient, malevolent intelligence. The air grew impossibly cold, stealing the warmth from his lungs, making his teeth ache. Then came the footsteps. They began subtly, a faint scuff of leather on stone, just to his left. He spun, his headlamp catching nothing. A moment later, a distinct, heavy tread sounded directly behind him. He whirled again, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Then, from his right, a light, almost skipping sound, followed by a slower, deliberate drag from the front. They were circling him. The footsteps multiplied, echoing from multiple directions at once. Heavy boots, bare feet, the dragging of something immense, the quick patter of small, desperate steps. They were not merely moving around him, they seemed to emanate from within the stone, from the air itself. It was a symphony of spectral movement, a phantom ballet of pursuit, each sound a testament to a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere. Elias stumbled over a loose stone, falling to his knees amidst the debris. He scrambled backward, his hands scraping against rough masonry. His eyes darted from shadow to shadow, from the hanging silhouettes above to the spectral bells that continued their slow, rhythmic tolling. The children's screams had faded, replaced by a low, guttural murmur that seemed to rise from the very earth beneath him, a sound of profound, ancient dissatisfaction. He saw the pages he had dropped earlier. They still lay where they had fallen, their shifting sigils seeming to glow with a faint internal luminescence, almost beckoning him. He realized with a sickening certainty that the intensification of these horrors had begun the moment he had read the forbidden scripture. He had not just observed history, he had activated it. He had not just found ancient texts, he had uncovered a living, breathing curse. A sudden fierce gust of wind, cold as the breath of a grave, swept through the chancel, though no windows were open nearby. It extinguished his headlamp. Plunged into absolute, crushing darkness, Elias gasped. The cold was absolute, piercing him to the bone. The footsteps, however, did not cease. They intensified, becoming a frantic, terrifying stampede all around him, 1,000 invisible entities closing in. The low, guttural murmur swelled into a chorus, a deep, resonant chant in that same alien, unknowable language as the scripture. It vibrated through the floor, through his very skull, distorting his perception, making his teeth ache. He could feel something brushing against him, a cold, insubstantial touch that sent jolts of pure terror through his body. It was like cobwebs, but frigid and clinging, moving with a purpose. He flailed wildly in the darkness, trying to ward off the unseen assailants. "No! Get away!" He screamed, his voice hoarse, cracking, but his words were drowned out by the infernal clamor, by the furious tolling of the phantom bells, by the guttural chanting that now seemed to rise from the very stone beneath his feet. He could smell it now, a new scent. Not dust, not decay, but something else entirely. A burning, metallic odor, like molten iron and ozone, mingling with a faint, cloying sweetness, like rotting flowers or putrefied flesh. It was the scent of something ancient and unholy, something truly alien. Panic, cold and absolute, gripped him. He scrambled blindly, desperately, trying to find his way out of the chancel, away from the unseen horrors that surrounded him. His hands fumbled, knocking against something solid, then something yielding and soft. He heard a soft, wet thump as it fell. He didn't dare think what it might be. The chanting grew louder, the earth beneath him beginning to tremble faintly. A low, resonant hum, deep in the foundations of the cathedral, began to build, a sound of immense power awakening. The stone floor beneath his hands felt strangely warm now, a pulsing heat that seeped through his gloves. He heard a groaning sound, a deep geological shift that echoed through the structure. It was not the sound of crumbling stone, but of something immense and powerful moving, straining, opening beneath the very spot where the altar had once stood. The chanting crescendoed and the ground trembled violently. Elias, still blind in the absolute darkness, felt the floor directly beneath him shift, cracking with a sound like splintering bone. A chasm was opening, a void of unimaginable depth, and from it a blast of heat, thick with that metallic, sweet, putrid odor, washed over him. The darkness intensified, a palpable, hungry presence, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that he had not merely awakened the ghosts of St. Meridian, he had opened a door, and something far, far worse was beginning to stir from the depths. Part 3. The floor beneath Elias bucked and groaned, splitting with a sound like ancient timber tearing, like stone grinding against stone in agonizing protest. The blast of heat from below intensified, a suffocating, infernal breath that tasted of sulfur and something impossibly old and malevolent. He scrambled, digging his fingers into the rapidly fracturing flagstones, desperate to avoid whatever chasm was opening beneath him. The chanting, a relentless guttural drone, now pulsed with the very tremors of the earth, as if the voices themselves were resonating from the bedrock. His headlamp, extinguished in the sudden violent gust, remained stubbornly dark. Elias fumbled for it, his hands shaking, but the darkness was absolute, a crushing, impenetrable weight. He could feel the edges of the rift widening, the jagged cracks spreading like a spider web across the chancel floor. A sickening lurch propelled him forward, and he clawed frantically at the splintering stone, his nails tearing against the rough surface. Then a light, not the clean, focused beam of his headlamp, but a terrible, pulsating glow that erupted from the depths of the opening chasm. It was a hellish red-black luminescence, swirling like a storm of impossible colors, a vortex of shadow and fire. It cast grotesque, dancing specters onto the walls of the cathedral, the ruined frescoes momentarily illuminated by this infernal light, their weeping saints now appearing to writhe in torment. The ground beneath Elias gave way completely. With a cry of sheer terror, he plummeted.
It wasn't a long fall, perhaps only a few feet, but it was enough to wrench a scream from his throat as he landed hard on what felt like a narrow, crumbling ledge. Pain lanced through his knee, a sharp, searing agony. He lay there, gasping, staring into the nightmare that had just birthed itself from the earth. The dimensional tear. It was real. Below him, where the altar had once stood, the chasm yawned. It was not a simple hole in the ground, but a void of swirling red-black space, a gaping maw into another dimension. It pulsed with an unholy light, like the beating heart of some cosmic horror. Within its depths, nebulae of impossible colors shifted and churned, stars of malevolence winking into and out of existence. It was a space that defied all known physics, a tear in the fabric of reality itself. From the heart of this swirling maelstrom, something began to emerge. Slowly, agonizingly, it pulled itself into the mortal realm. First, a single limb, thick and obsidian black, its surface ridged and scaled like ancient volcanic rock. Then another and another, unfolding with a grotesque chitinous grace. It was multi-limbed, an abomination of biological impossibility, each limb ending in wicked curved claws that scraped against the edges of the dimensional rift with a sound like tearing metal. A head followed, rising ponderously from the void. It was horned, not with the elegant, curving antlers of a stag, but with immense, jagged protrusions that spiraled upwards like petrified tree roots carved from black basalt. Its skin, where it wasn't covered by these monstrous limbs, was a sickly, mottled red-black, like congealed blood and shadow. And upon its surface, carved deeply into its flesh, were runes. They glowed with an internal fire, like molten metal, pulsating with the same unnerving, shifting light Elias had seen on the forbidden scripture. Each rune seemed to burn with an infernal heat, casting flickering, demonic shadows across its impossibly vast form. It was immense, filling the chasm, its bulk dwarfing the entire chancel. Its eyes, when they finally opened, were twin pools of liquid fire, swirling with the same red-black void from which it had emerged. They fixed on Elias, a gaze of ancient, fathomless malice that pierced him to his very soul. A voice, deeper than the earth, older than time, filled the cathedral. It was not a single voice, but a chorus layered with dozens of tones, some human, some bestial, some like the grinding of tectonic plates, others like the whisper of a dying star. It was a cacophony of impossible sound, yet perfectly articulated, each syllable resonating with immense power. This house was not built for God. It was built for me. The words vibrated through Elias's entire being, shaking him to his core. They were spoken in English, but it was an English twisted and warped, each word laced with a venomous inflection that spoke of eons of malevolence. The very air grew heavy, thick with the demon's presence, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He could feel its gaze burning into him, stripping away his defenses, peeling back the layers of his sanity. The creature continued to rise, its immense form unfurling from the dimensional tear until its horned head nearly brushed the tattered remnants of the ceiling. It was a living eclipse, a mountain of sinew and shadow, its glowing runes casting an infernal light that seemed to drain the very color from the ruined cathedral. The hanging silhouettes above, previously terrifying, now seemed like pathetic, insignificant motes of dust in comparison to this colossal entity.
The whispers, the phantom footsteps, the tolling bells, all faded into a subservient murmur, a terrified chorus silenced by the sheer, overwhelming power of the being that now dominated the space. Even the children's screams were gone, replaced by a profound, shuddering silence, as if every ghost in the cathedral held its breath in terror. Elias, pinned to the crumbling ledge, could only stare, transfixed by the horror. His mind, trained for logic and reason, struggled to comprehend what his eyes were witnessing. This was not a myth, not a legend. This was raw, unadulterated evil, a being from a reality utterly inimical to his own. The demon shifted its weight, a slow, deliberate movement that caused the entire cathedral to groan and protest. Its multi-limbed form rippled, each glowing rune on its skin flaring brighter for an instant. It seemed to inhale the very air, drawing the essence of the ruined church into itself. "You have come seeking knowledge, historian," its layered voice boomed, resonating through Elias's chest cavity. "And knowledge you shall receive, but not of the mundane, not of the ephemeral. You seek the truth of this place, and the truth is, I am the truth." Its enormous head tilted, those swirling pools of fire eyes narrowing on Elias. He felt a sudden, profound coldness, not external, but internal, a chill that radiated from his very soul. It was the sensation of being utterly exposed, utterly vulnerable to an intelligence so vast and ancient it defied human understanding. For centuries I have slumbered, a fragment of my essence housed within these sacred stones. They thought to imprison me, they thought to bind me, fools. The last word was a hiss, layered with the sound of grinding stone and tearing flesh. Elias's gaze drifted to the pages he had dropped. They lay on the edge of the chasm, tantalizingly close, their shifting sigils still pulsing with that faint internal light. He remembered the whispers, the intensification of the terror when he had read the symbols. He had not just found ancient texts, he had recited an incantation, unwittingly performing a ritual to call this very entity. The realization hit him like a physical blow, a wave of sickening guilt and terror. He, the skeptical historian, had opened the gates of hell. The demon's head lowered slightly, its voice softening, yet becoming even more terrifying in its intimacy. "You are the key." Each word was delivered with a chilling emphasis, stretching out, resonating in the very air. Your curiosity, your hubris, your desire to peel back the veils of time, it is a weakness, a doorway, and you have walked right through. A low, guttural chuckle, layered with the sounds of cracking ice and distant thunder, rumbled through the chancel. The red-black void behind the demon pulsed, expanding slightly, as if eager to consume more of this reality. Elias tried to move, to push himself away from the edge, but his body was paralyzed by fear, his muscles locked in a desperate, futile struggle against the unseen force that held him captive. The pain in his knee was a distant echo, drowned out by the overwhelming terror. Then, from the shadows that clung to the pillars, from the very dust motes dancing in the infernal light of the demon, shapes began to form. They were not the indistinct silhouettes from before, but clearer, more defined. Wisps of translucent forms coalescing from the gloom. The ghosts. They were emerging, drawn forth by the overwhelming power of the entity, shimmering into a terrifying ethereal clarity. They surrounded Elias, not touching him, but pressing in with their silent, sorrowful presence. Their forms were indistinct, yet he could perceive the outlines of faces, of tattered clothing, of hands reaching out, not to harm him, but to show him something. Their eyes, or what appeared to be eyes, were empty, devoid of light, yet filled with an ancient, profound sorrow. The demon watched them, its fiery gaze unwavering. "They wish to show you, mortal," it rumbled, its voice laced with a cruel amusement. "They wish to reveal the truth of their fate, the truth of this place, the truth of my dominion." As the demon spoke, the swirling red-black void behind it intensified, a vortex of cosmic dread. The ghosts pressed closer to Elias, their translucent forms shimmering, their silent, empty eyes fixed on him.
He felt a surge of cold, not the physical cold, but the spiritual chill of absolute despair. They were not just showing him a vision, they were preparing him for a revelation, a truth so horrifying it had been buried beneath centuries of stone and fear. The air grew thick with expectation, the suffocating presence of the demon, and the silent, desperate plea of the spectral witnesses. The secrets of St. Meridian, the true nature of Father Alaric's ritual, and the unspeakable horror that had consumed this place were about to be unveiled. And Elias, the intrepid historian, was now a captive audience to a truth that would shatter his world. Part 4. The ghosts pressed closer, a shimmering, translucent throng of spectral sorrow.
Their forms, though ethereal, exuded a profound sense of anguish, a centuries-old despair that now seemed to congeal into a palpable atmosphere around Elias. He could feel their cold, silent desperation, their desperate need to convey the unspeakable truth. The demon, an infernal monument of horn and glowing rune, watched from the dimensional tear. Its multi-layered voice, a low, rumbling drone of anticipation, a cruel puppeteer enjoying the unfolding drama. Without warning, the cathedral was no longer ruined. The fractured ceiling mended itself. The shattered stained glass reformed, vibrant and whole, casting mosaics of holy light across the nave. The toppled pews righted themselves, polished and gleaming.
The altar, once a heap of rubble, stood majestic and pristine, adorned with candles whose flames burned with an unholy, blue-tinged light. The air, though still heavy with the demon's presence, took on the scent of ancient incense and beeswax. It was St. Meridian, reborn, but twisted, a mockery of its former glory. Elias was no longer on the crumbling ledge. He stood in the center of the chancel, a silent observer in a terrifying tableau. The ghosts were around him, their forms solidifying, losing their transparency, becoming almost fully corporeal. They were no longer mere silhouettes, but men and women in period attire, their faces etched with a mixture of fervent devotion and growing terror. They were the parishioners, the clergy, the community that had once filled this space.
The vision began. It was a night of furious storm. Rain lashed against the newly mended stained glass windows, and thunder cracked like the wrath of an angry god. Yet, within the cathedral, a strange, feverish calm prevailed. At the altar stood Father Alaric, younger than Elias had imagined, his face gaunt, his eyes burning with an unsettling zeal. He was surrounded by a dozen other priests, their robes crisp, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and fanaticism. Elias watched, helpless, as the priests began a chant. It was not Latin, not the familiar liturgies of the church. It was the same ancient, guttural tongue he had heard rising from the dimensional tear, the language of the forbidden scripture. As they chanted, the air grew thick and heavy, and the altar stone, miraculously whole in this vision, began to glow with a faint internal red light. Father Alaric, his voice rising above the others, held open a book. It was the book, the very one Elias had discovered, its sigils pulsating with an unnatural, sickly luminescence. The priests around him swayed, their eyes fixed on the tome, their faces contorting with a strange mixture of rapture and agony. As the chant reached a crescendo, the stained glass saints in the windows began to weep, not tears of sorrow, but thick, viscous trails of crimson. The sacred figures on the frescoes twisted, their serene expressions morphing into silent screams. The holy water in the fonts turned black and curdled, emitting a foul metallic odor. The floor beneath the altar began to crack, not with the violent rupture Elias had witnessed moments ago, but with a slow, deliberate fracture, as if something immense and unseen was pushing from beneath, tearing at the very fabric of consecrated ground. The red light from the altar intensified, casting long, demonic shadows that danced independently of the priests' bodies, writhing and stretching like living things. Then the dimensional tear opened. It was smaller this time, a gaping maw of swirling red-black energy, but no less terrifying. From its depths, not the full multi-limbed entity, but a fragment. A swirling vortex of shadow and fire, an eye of pure malevolence, detached and burning. It pulsed with a terrible power, a condensed essence of the demon Elias now saw hovering above him. The priest's chanting faltered, turning into gasps of terror. Father Alaric, however, his face now a mask of ecstatic madness, reached out his hand towards the swirling fragment. He was not trying to banish it. He was trying to contain it, to draw it into the cathedral, to bind it to this earthly plane. He believed he was harnessing a divine power, a force to reshape the world. The fragment pulsed, its fiery eye widening, fixating on Father Alaric, and then it struck. It was not a physical blow, not a burst of fire or a bolt of lightning. It was far, far worse. The fragment of Satan's essence extended tendrils of pure darkness, not touching the priests, but engulfing their souls. Elias watched in horror as the priests, one by one, began to contort. Their bodies did not break, did not bleed. Their forms began to invert. Their skin seemed to recede, their muscles to hollow, their bones to twist inward. It was as if their very essence, their spiritual core, was being turned inside out. Their faces became masks of silent agony, their eyes widening in impossible horror as they witnessed their own souls being wrenched from their physical forms and inverted into living shadows. They collapsed, not as dead men, but as grotesque parodies of their former selves. Their bodies lay unmoving, yet from each a shimmering, dark silhouette rose, a perfect, inverted mirror of their physical form. These shadows were not merely darkness, they were an absence of light so profound it seemed to suck the illumination from the air. These were the hanging silhouettes Elias had seen earlier, the independent shadows that had stalked him. They were the priests themselves, their souls turned inside out, trapped in an eternal inverted torment. Father Alaric was the last. His transformation was the most agonizing. His face, once zealously mad, contorted into an expression of dawning, cosmic terror as he realized the true nature of what he had summoned. His soul was torn from him, stretched and twisted, inverted into a shadow that screamed without a sound, a silent, infinite agony. His physical body slumped, an empty husk. The vision shifted. The cathedral, once pristine, now showed signs of immediate decay. Dust settled instantly, cobwebs appeared, and the mended glass shattered once more. The demonic fragment pulsed, its work complete, and then retreated back into the dimensional tear, leaving the chasm to close with a sickening crack. The voices of the inverted priests, the silent screams, remained, echoing through the now ruined space. The townspeople, drawn by the unnatural storm and the strange glows from the cathedral, arrived too late. They found the priests' empty bodies and the lingering, suffocating presence of something unspeakably evil. They saw the shadows, the inverted souls, and they fled, spreading tales of a plague, of a presence not meant for this universe. The church was abandoned, sealed, left to rot, a monument to a catastrophic ritual. The vision ended. The cathedral returned to its present state, ruined, dust-choked, silent. The ghosts, the inverted souls of the priests and parishioners, were once again shimmering, translucent figures, their empty eyes fixed on Elias. Their sorrow was immense, their silent plea clear. We suffered this fate, we are trapped here, because of the summoning, because of the book. Above him, the colossal, multi-limbed demon pulsed, its glowing runes flaring with satisfaction. Its layered voice, a cruel symphony of ancient evil, rumbled through the chancel. They sought to wield my power, mortal. They sought to bind a fragment of my essence for their own petty ambitions. They believed themselves masters of the occult. They were but puppets dancing on the strings of their own ignorance. Its head tilted, its fiery gaze sweeping across the spectral forms of the inverted priests. Their fate is an eternal testament to their folly. Their souls, turned inside out, forever bound to this place, feeding the remnant of my power, maintaining the thin veil between worlds. Elias felt a chill colder than any physical temperature. He understood now. The whispers, the footsteps, the bells. These were not merely hauntings. They were the echoes of souls perpetually inverted, their agony a constant, low-frequency hum that sustained the demonic presence. The cathedral was not just a ruined church. It was a prison, a battery, and a gateway. The demon's gaze returned to Elias, its eyes burning with an intense predatory hunger. And now, mortal, you have awakened me fully. The veil thins. The swirling red-black void behind the demon intensified, expanding rapidly. It was no longer a mere tear, but a gaping portal, a monstrous eye opening into an entirely different dimension. From its depths, a profound guttural chanting began to rise, not of human origin, but of something far more ancient, far more terrifying. It was a chorus of cosmic dread, a language of pure malevolence that vibrated through the very fabric of reality. The air in the cathedral grew impossibly dense, charged with an overwhelming, oppressive energy. The very concept of up and down began to lose its meaning. Elias felt a sickening vertigo, as if the entire structure was twisting, turning, preparing to be torn from its earthly moorings. He looked at the spectral priests, their silent, empty eyes filled with a desperate warning. They were trapped. They understood what was coming, and he was about to join them. The demon had not just been awakened, it was now fully unleashed, and its true purpose for this ancient, ruined church was about to become horrifyingly clear. The final nightmare was at hand. The cathedral groaned, not with the familiar settling of ancient stone, but with a living, agonizing protest. The very air, already thick with the demon's oppressive presence, became a physical entity, pressing down on Elias, stealing the breath from his lungs. The swirling red-black void behind the multi-limbed entity expanded, not just in the chancel, but seemed to swallow the entire space, turning the once sacred interior into a vast, pulsating maw. The ground beneath Elias's feet ceased to be solid. He felt a sickening lurch, a sensation of being untethered, adrift in a maelstrom of unreality. The stone floor buckled and rippled like disturbed water. The massive pillars, once stoic guardians of the nave, began to warp, their rigid lines softening, twisting into impossible serpentine forms that defied architectural logic. Stone became pliable, wood became liquid, and the very concept of gravity seemed to be a forgotten dream. He looked around, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror as reality itself began to unravel. The pews, those silent witnesses to centuries of prayer and eventual abandonment, tore themselves from the floor. With a sound like splintering bone and tortured wood, they levitated, twisting into grotesque, spiraling shapes, resembling skeletal hands reaching for a sky that no longer existed. They spun in slow, deliberate arcs, their shadows dancing wildly on walls that now undulated like membranes. The stained glass windows, which had been momentarily restored in the ghost's vision, now wept anew. But this time, it was not crimson trails of allegory. From the eyes of the saints, from the wounds of the crucified, from the chalices held aloft, thick, viscous blood began to ooze. It was a dark, almost black ichor, dripping slowly, inexorably, down the panes, pooling on the levitating pews, staining the air with its metallic, putrid scent. The holy figures seemed to scream in silent agony, their painted faces contorting in a torment more profound than any human imagination could conjure. The ancient chanting, which had risen from the dimensional tear, now flooded the audio, becoming an omnipresent, deafening roar. It was no longer a distant chorus, but a torrent of sound, 1,000 voices speaking in that alien, guttural tongue, reverberating through Elias's skull, shattering the last remnants of his sanity. It was the language of pure chaos, of primordial darkness, a symphony of damnation. Each syllable was a hammer blow, each word a spike driven into his mind. Then the ceiling, the tattered, gaping maw of the ruined roof which had allowed the moon to bleed through, began to close. Not with stone and mortar, but with a living, fleshy membrane. It pulsed, a vast, grotesque eyelid slowly lowering over the cathedral. And in its center, slowly, ponderously, an enormous eye began to open. It was not a human eye, nor a beast's. It was an ocular abyss, a swirling vortex of red-black, mirroring the dimensional tear below. Its iris was a spiral galaxy of malevolence, its pupil a void of infinite depth. It blinked slowly, deliberately, its gaze fixing on Elias with an unnerving, all-encompassing awareness. It was the eye of something that had seen universes born and die, an ancient cosmic horror that had now turned its full, undivided attention upon him. The multi-limbed entity, the demon that had emerged from the rift, was no longer confined to the chancel. It stretched, its colossal form expanded, its obsidian limbs elongating, becoming impossibly vast. It spread across the entirety of the cathedral, its horned head brushing the nascent eyelid of the ceiling, its glowing runes burning with a searing intensity that seemed to incinerate the very air. It was a living eclipse, its shadow swallowing all remaining light, casting the world into an eternal twilight of infernal glow and consuming darkness. Its presence was so vast, so overwhelming, that Elias could no longer perceive its individual features. It was simply there, an unholy mountain, a sentient void, encompassing everything. The air thinned, becoming difficult to breathe. Elias felt a crushing pressure from all sides, as if the very dimensions were collapsing in on him. The spectral priests, the inverted souls, floated around him, their empty eyes now wide with a fresh, infinite horror, their silent screams echoing the cacophony of the demons chanting. They were his only companions in this final descent, the eternal witnesses to his own damnation. He had to escape. The thought was a desperate, primal urge cutting through the terror. He had to run.
He pushed himself forward, his injured knee screaming in protest, but the pain was a distant, insignificant prickle compared to the agony of his unraveling reality. He pushed towards the main doors, the warped iron-banded doors that had shrieked their welcome hours, or perhaps centuries ago. They were now a swirling vortex of dark wood and twisted metal, pulsating with the same red-black energy as the dimensional rift. The path was a treacherous labyrinth of levitating pews, bleeding saints, and the grasping shadows of the inverted priests.
As he staggered, the demon's layered voice, a roar that obliterated all other sound, boomed through the collapsing space. "You cannot escape, mortal. This realm is mine now." Elias felt a sudden, invisible force slam into him, knocking him off his feet. He landed hard, the air knocked from his lungs. He struggled to rise, his vision blurring, the horrifying tableau of the interdimensional nightmare spinning around him. The demon's voice, now closer, more intimate, yet still layered with 1,000 hellish tones, reverberated directly inside his mind. "You read the scripture." He could feel the cold, slick parchment of the forbidden pages still lying near the edge of the dimensional rift, their sigils glowing with a hungry, triumphant light. He had touched them. He had read them. He had opened the way. "You opened the gate." The words were a condemnation, a final, inescapable truth. His academic curiosity, his skeptical mind, had been the unwitting tools of an ancient evil. He was not merely an observer, he was a participant, an accomplice. Now your soul belongs to the space between worlds. As the demon spoke, the very air around Elias began to tear. Not just the cathedral, but the fabric of his personal space. Tendrils of red-black energy, like grasping phantom limbs, erupted from the ground, from the walls, from the very air itself. They coiled around his ankles, his wrists, his chest. They were cold, impossibly cold, yet they burned with an infernal heat. He screamed. A raw, guttural sound of pure terror and despair, torn from the depths of his being. The tendrils tightened, pulling him, dragging him inexorably towards the vast, swirling abyss of the dimensional rift that now consumed the entire chancel. He fought, scrabbling at the ground, his nails tearing, his muscles straining against the unimaginable force. His scream echoed, a desperate human sound, swallowed by the chanting, by the roar of the demon, by the collapsing reality. The tendrils pulled him faster, lifting him from the floor. He saw the enormous eye in the ceiling, watching, impassive. He saw the bleeding saints, their agony a silent testament to his fate. He saw the inverted priests, their empty eyes mirroring his own terror, their eternal torment, now his impending reality. He was dragged over the edge of the chasm, the red-black void rushing up to meet him. His scream, once a clear human sound, began to distort. It twisted, fractured, splitting into multiple inhuman frequencies. It deepened, becoming guttural, animalistic. The sound rippled, cracked, and then, as Elias Turner was consumed by the interdimensional rift, his final desperate shriek transformed. It was no longer a scream, it was a low, resonant growl, a sound of primordial malice, layered with something ancient and infernal, a sound that echoed from the depths of the void, a new voice joining the chorus of damnation, ready to utter the dark, forbidden syllables of the scripture he had so foolishly read. The historian was gone. Only the growl remained, an eternal testament to the entity that had claimed his soul, forever bound to the space between worlds. Only the growl remained, an eternal testament to the entity that had claimed his soul, forever bound to the space between worlds.